what are we doing today? Well, none of this looks like electronics, you might think. And you'd be right. Well, coronavirus is having an effect on everybody, including us, and it's making bread a little bit difficult to find. So something we keep in the back of our cupboard pretty much all the time is a big bag of baker's flour. So I decided it's time to dip into that. So we're going to make some bread, but crucially, I'm going to make a garlic and cheese loaf, or two of. And a few people have asked me about this recipe, and I know this is not sort of strictly electronics on this channel, but I look at this channel more like a survival channel, mostly electronic survival, but I did actually have plans of doing a lot of like survival and bushcrafty stuff, and some of that might come, you'll find out. But yeah, anyway, let's get cracking with this, and we'll make ourselves some bread. Of course, because the schools have shut down, or it's school holidays, but it's come a little earlier, you'll hear my apprentice in the background having some fun. Now, what will you need for this? Well, you'll need some baker's flour, which is basically plain flour, not self-raising. Need a tiny smidgen of sugar, but not very much at all. Need some cheese. I'm using a tasty cheddar. You could use like any sort of matured cheddar or whatever cheese you prefer. And some good old garlic. I'm also using some yeast, which we keep in the fridge. And that's about it. The only other thing I'll be using is probably a little bit of cold press extra virgin olive oil, just in the final stages. And I'll use a little bit of butter just to grease the pans up so that stuff doesn't stick. But yeah, let's get on to measuring stuff out. Alright, well the first thing I'm going to do before I start everything is take a mug here with some lukewarm water, and this is about body temperature. And yes, I did wash my hands very thoroughly before I started. Now, I'll take a little bit of sugar. This is going to be, by a little bit I mean like maybe a quarter of a teaspoon. Just a little bit, give the yeast something to live off when we start. Now we can put the sugar away because that's all we'll need. And we're going to take some yeast here. I'm going to put a good teaspoonful in here. That'll probably be plenty for what we're doing. I'll let that start, and you'll see it'll start to go a little milky when we mix it around like this. That's a good sign. So I'll let that sit and start growing off to the side for a moment. While everything's warming up, we're going to open our bag of flour and we're going to portion a bit out. Now, when you've got good flour and good yeast, it usually rises pretty well. If you've got cheap flour like the $1 a bag Coles flour, which we have a little bit of, it doesn't tend to rise so much. But generally I need about 1.5 cups per loaf tin. So we're going to do 3 cups today. That should give us plenty to fill both tins. Okay, so off to the side here I've got some hot water in a milkshake cup, and I've got an extra little bit of flour here for dusting. That'll be important in a minute. We're going to put all this aside for a bit. I'm going to give my yeast a little bit of a mix, which is nicely frothing away over there. Now I've got garlic, which will get ready to go. Now we've got to grate some cheese. This is going to be garlic and cheese loaf. And normally most people would add a little bit of salt to help retard the yeast growth, but I think the cheese and the garlic do a good job of that. The garlic specifically. Now I have flour covered block of cheese, but first world problems. I'll just grate off the corners. That should be plenty cheese. You notice I'm doing most of this as a bit of an eyeball thing. I'll add that in a moment and get this out of the way. Now what I like to do is I like to add my cheese now and get it slightly coated in flour first. It sort of helps distribute it through the whole thing. I'm making a fairly heavily cheesy loaf, and it's because we like. So I'm sort of getting it evenly distributed through the flour first. Okay. And we'll add the garlic a little bit later on in the process. Now it's time to add our yeast before it gets too far away, and you can see it's frothing up nicely. Add our yeast in here. We're going to add a bit of warm water. Now, initially I'm going to stir it with a wooden spoon until we get to the phase where we've got to knead it all. So we'll mix all that in. I'm just adding water here, just eyeballing it until it gets to about the right consistency. When it does that, then we'll add the garlic. Again, the water needs to be about body temperature. It's all good. Right, we'll be back in a moment. It's time to add the garlic. I'm going to add a big wallop of garlic in here. This will slow the yeast down a bit, but about as much as salt would. Alright. Put all that away. Now mix everything in. I'm going to keep this mixing around a bit. At this point I've got it a little, the garlic has made it a little bit too wet, so I'll add a little bit more flour in here to dry it all up. At this point we're going to put it onto the board over here, or the table. Spread it out. Pretty easy. It'll all come out. This is where we get to the fun bit and why we need to clean hands. Right. This is not bad. We'll sprinkle a little bit on the top just to absorb extra moisture. And we'll just flatten out, fold, flatten out and fold, and just keep repeating that until you get it right. Pushing away from the gap beside the stove there, so we don't have to move the stove to clean down there. Right. Now at this point, if you've got good yeast and it's getting away, or it's starting to grow, it'll get nice and stretchy. And that's exactly what you want. A little bit more flour. Now at this point I'm going to add a touch of oil. A little tiny bit of olive oil to help the process along a bit. Just a little bit, you don't need much. I'm going to fold that in. This is a little bit like making pizza bases, which I did once upon a time, actually to make up the money to get to the USA the first time to propose to my wife. Well, she's now my wife, she wasn't at the time, hence the need to propose. And I say need, because yeah, times were dire, I guess you could call it. Now we're getting a nice sort of stretchy, even dough. It's looking quite good. I'll just keep going a little bit longer, and then we'll separate this out and put in loaf tins. Alright, now we need a little bit of butter, although you guys could use olive oil or margarine or whatever you really want that will lubricate a cake mold. I like to take a little bit off the side of the block and rub it around with my hands. Seems to really be the best way to do this, is just to get your hands into it. And these are cheap little tins that are very slippery when your hands are covered in butter. These are cheap tins you can get at the supermarket quite readily. But you could, if you really wanted to, just do this on a baking tray. This is basically a universal bread recipe. You can make rolls, you can make loaves, you can make all sorts of little things with this. We actually have a pizza pan hidden away in the cupboard too. You could certainly use that. There's one pan done. We'll do the other and we'll be right back. What's not noticeable to me that might be to you guys is that this has probably risen off camera whilst I've been doing this. So what we're going to do, we're going to cut this roughly in half, and we're going to make ourselves 2 loaves. This is pretty much it for the bread recipe. There's nothing much more than really yeast and water in it, or yeast, water and flour. Be a pretty weird loaf of bread with just yeast and water. Alright, the loaf of bread is going to go in here. I'm going to push it off into the sides Not all the way to the corners, but enough that it makes a loaf sort of shape. I'm going to do the same with this one. I'll get it loosely right. It's already starting to fluff up. And this process here acts as punching it down for the first time, which will result in a slightly finer bread instead of the big holes you're used to seeing in commercial bread. And I'll show you a loaf in a moment of commercial bread for comparison. I have a bag of commercial bread here, and I'm having some dexterity problems. Now, let's have a look at this. This is commercial bread, and you notice there's big voids and everything all through here. That is probably the result of both extra yeast and also bread improver. Now, ours will look a little bit finer than that because we're punching it down once and we're also rising it ourselves with something to slow the production of the yeast, in this case garlic. Otherwise you could add a pinch of salt. But anyway, we've stuck a tea towel over these. How about we go put these somewhere warm? Alright, so that's them put in a warm spot. We happen to have a gas hot water service, and it's got a flat top, and on the top there is just about 25-30 degrees Celsius. Perfect temperature to be rising bread. So we'll check back in on that in a couple of hours. In the meantime, I've got to get on with the cleanup. Now, while we wait for the bread to rise, I'm going to have a quick chat. Why am I doing cooking all of a sudden when mostly my stuff's called the Aussie repair guy? Well, you could say repairing hunger is a repair of sorts. Anyway, this channel is mostly here for the sake of my kids, and particularly my oldest, who I don't have the best relationship with right now, but at some point she will want to know what I've been up to. The other reason here, there are some really simple daily life skills that a lot of people seem to be lacking. One of those is making bread. Another one is making soap. But these are things that don't require a lot of effort or a lot of skill, although you can involve that if you really want. You can get really elitist about these if you want. But for the basic functions of, hey, I need to eat and I need to keep clean, two things that are pretty essential right now, well, most of the time, in fact, they're not hard to do, and I don't do any of these things to a really high level of expertise, but I do them acceptably. And so I'm not professing to be an expert on these things. I'm just trying to survive at the moment when we can't really buy the good bread. And buying soap fundamentally is a bit of a problem, despite the fact that there should be enough to go around with everyone. So some of you might also criticize why I happen to have a 5-kilo bag of flour in the cupboard. Well, that's been there for a long time before coronavirus. Because we're on an income support supplement, we also do, we buy by a fortnight. I'm trying to think my words out carefully here. We purchase our food every fortnight, something we now can't do, but that means that most of the time we have a couple of weeks worth of food in the cupboard at any given point in time. If we happen to, if our bills are cheaper than expected or something like that, we usually buy a bit of long life food and stick it in the cupboard, just in case there's some sort of a situation like what we've got now, or if there's just a general interruption to supply. We live in a land of floods and bushfires and fairly massive sized disasters, apparently. So yeah, it's just generally good practice to be stocked up a little bit. We haven't raced out and hoarded everything. We haven't gone and shoved the cupboard full of big bags of flour and everything like that. It's just at this point in time, this is where we're actually using our supplies, because this is a good time to do it. It means we can minimize the amount of times we have to go out in public, especially at the moment when Victoria's been locked down, no non-essential travel. So that means we can limit our exposure by using our supplies up a little bit. And we're just purchasing a little bit every now and then just to maintain what we've used. So if the worst case scenario happens and we're all locked down for 2 weeks, we should be fine. My apprentice, on the other hand, is going to go a little bit insane, but we're working out some ideas. We had planned to go camping, but we're going to set up our camping gear in the backyard or the front yard and try and get the best of that without leaving the property. So yeah, and at the moment I'm trying to do some helpful things like show you guys how to make bread, how to make soap. I might do a little bit on solar power and regulators and stuff. You guys can leave a comment and tell me what sort of stuff you're interested in seeing, and if I've got a skill base that might assist, I'll try and do something in that regard. But it's worth noting, I don't do these channels for profit. This is just purely for my own interest. So yeah, anyway, let's move on. I think in all this yakking and everything, and through the miracle of time traveling YouTube videos and wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff, our bread should probably be risen by now. Right, well, I've retrieved our bread off the water heater. And we can take the cover off and we can see that they've all rised very nicely, or risen very nicely. My language has gone up a creek. And that one not so much, but it was in a less ideal spot. Still, nonetheless, quite usable. So, we need to go down here. I've got the oven already warmed up, and we're going to bump that to about 180. That's usually where I cook most things. And we're going to bump that in there for about probably 25 to 30 minutes or so. We're going to check it with a torch through the window once it's in there. And you know what? I think Android has a little routine in here that when you turn the screen on, it shoves notifications at you, because I don't hear it the rest of the time. It wouldn't surprise me if it's a Google thing to try and shove advertising in your face. Anyway, I might put a little bit of oil on the top of these, just a sprinkle, then I'm going to put them in the oven. So the oil, not going to be much. If I had a brush, I'd brush this over the top, but this is just to create a little bit of cosmetic effect. Just a capful. A little bit along here. There we go. A little bit up there. And of course we don't have any paper towel either right now. So because I've cleaned my hands again, it is very soft right now. Just spread that around a little bit. Tough times, haven't got paper towel or a brush. Right, these have got to go in the oven. The timer part. This is a project I put together quite some time ago. It's a little OLED display and a DigiSpark in a box, and that should start timing away and should let me know in a few minutes. Actually, it should let me know at 10 minutes, 20 minutes and 30 and then 45. But anyway, we'll wait for 3 beeps, which means 30 minutes, and we'll be back. Alright, so it's time to pull them out of the oven. I'm going to pull the small loaf out first. And we use appropriate PPE here. And backup PPE. Alright, let's flip one out on the tray. That one's going to need some help. We'll let them cool off for a minute. My backup plan here. Usually this does the trick. No, I'll have to separate them out the hard way. Still not quite enough butter in the bottom, but we've got a good loaf of bread. Let's try the other one. perfect. Came out just right. Alright, well it's cool, and we'll slice a little bit off and put some fresh butter on it. Now, with this kind of bread, you don't need much but a bit of butter. It is its own meal. It's, I haven't got a proper bread knife, but this is close. Still a serrated knife. Fresh hot bread. And you'll see what I mean about the difference in texture between the commercial bread. It's a much denser bread, but you know, that's almost a meal on its own in that slice. And I'm just cutting very gently because it's very soft still while it's hot. It'll firm up a bit when it's left to sit and cool, but I want a couple of bits right now. So before I do much else, I'm going to taste test some. This is fresh, real salted butter. Because why not? Put a little bit of that on and let it melt into it. Perfect. I'll see you guys later. I'm going to eat some.